The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello, and help me welcome the Honorable former Speaker, William O'Brien. Bill,
hey, Carl,
thank you. Lord.
Nice to have you here with me.
How do you think that everything's going in your campaign so far?
Oh, it's going well. You know, one of the things I'm really picking up as I'm out there attending all these meetings is the enthusiasm in my party, our party, you know, for the upcoming election. You know, I think there's a real appreciation of the fact that people are catching on to how radical the House Democrats are, and I use House Democrats generically, just not in Congress, but in the State House, just how absolutely crazy they are.
That's
so.
True.
You know, the Democrats, I think, had one obligation this term, and that was to not act crazy. You know, and they couldn't even pull that off. You know, we're seeing going on in Washington as an example of that.
But they're not learning. I mean, they don't see that they're wrong for some reason. And I don't know. They seem to believe that everybody's on their side. And I keep hearing more and more people that aren't.
Yeah. It reminds me of Maureen Dowd, who was a writer for the New York Times. And this is going back years and years. And I think it was the election, maybe in the re-election, actually, of Richard Nixon. She said, I don't know how he got elected. I don't know one person who voted for him. And no, probably Maureen, you didn't. You write for the New York Times. They live in a bubble. They only talk to themselves. They read the New York Times. They watch MSNBC. They have a limited access to information, and then they're motivated by pure hatred. Pure hatred because he wasn't supposed to win.
Wow.
We deplorables weren't supposed to vote him into office.
And yet he's done so much that he said he was going to do. And the situation economically is great.
Yeah. I mean, I mention that a lot when I'm talking to the groups. You know, I mentioned how one of the first endorsements I received when I was running for the U.S. Senate was Ray Buckley, who's head of the Democrat State Committee, and he said, you know, Bill O'Brien, we can't have him. He was Trump before they're Trump, and you know, I take a certain amount of pride in that. I take pride in it because Trump is a person who keeps his promises, and that was always very important to me.
That's right.
Is to keep promises. If you say, for example, you're going to move the U.S. Embassy to Israel, to Jerusalem, you're not just one of the train of candidates we've had over the last 30 years come to New Hampshire and say that. You're a person who does it, and he did it. And similarly, when I was running for speaker and talking to my constituents in my district to get elected as a state rep, and then to various folks who are running for state representative, I said, we're not going to take this huge deficit that has been handed to us and cover it with tax cuts, tax increases. Rather, we're going to look at how much we're spending and only spend what is going to be covered by revenues. And so we did that. And, you know,
and it was very good the way you handled it. I thought, you know, it was my first time being experienced because you did appoint me as a vice chair, and hearing how everybody actually was able to talk. And in our caucuses, we had some discussions. Sometimes, you know, some people were very favorable on something that you didn't think should go through, and people would speak up in supporting your point of view, and you just let the people talk.
Well, you know, because I was only one voice, you know, seriously, you know, if you're in a leadership position, you have to be humble. And you have to recognize that there's people around you, all of whom know something that you don't know, just as you know something they don't know, and have experiences that you haven't had, just as you've had experiences they haven't had, and all contribute together. You know, what was important to me when we were doing those cuts was to establish, I think, some principles all would agree to. If you're not going to increase taxes, you have to ask, what is a necessary function of government, what is a desirable function, maybe something people become used to and cause a great deal of dislocation if you withdrew from it too quickly, and what is just completely unnecessary,
Mm-hmm.
just an absolute luxury item. And I asked people to apply those standards, and as they did, we might differ on where things fall in those categories, and that was a good discussion. It allowed us to, I think, bring spending down to not just a level that would avoid taxes, but a level that right-sizes government so that it's not too big.
Right. And you even carried that on to when we had to redistrict everything, because that was, again, a year that we had to look at the census and see how the boundaries of the different voting districts.
Yeah, and so I still hear it to this day. So we're getting on to, geez, about 8 or 10 years since that happened. And people say, oh, well, you redistrict, the way they do in perhaps Illinois or New York State. And for the House of Representatives in New Hampshire, it's very difficult to do that because there are rules. We had passed a constitutional amendment people voted in 2006 that said essentially we have to have the smallest districts possible. Each ward, each town has a right to, if at all possible, their own representation. That's the way it is in Nashua now. We have a couple of reps per ward. And so you have that rule. Then no district can cross a county line because the state representatives, most people may not be aware of this, sit on what we call the county delegation, but is really the legislature for the county. And so you can't have someone who's in two counties. So when you take those size restrictions, you take the geographical restrictions, and then you overlay it, Supreme Court cases that say you can't have more deviation. I think it might have been more than 5% from one district to another. Then you have very little opportunity to engage in shenanigans. In other, maybe executive council you might be able to. State Senate districts are so much bigger, and you can cross county lines with them and all. It was an exercise in responsibility. I think we did a pretty good job.
I agree with you. I didn't have any experience with it, but I saw that one thing that we didn't like in Nashua is that the 10 years before they had grouped 3 wards together, so that 10 people had to be elected by 3 wards together. That was a real mess in a way.
It really was. And you know how that came up was there was a redistricting that took place for the 2000 election, and the Democrats sued right before you sign up and all. As these lawsuits always are, they're intended to be as disruptive as possible. And eventually it was rushed into the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, oh, no, you haven't done it right, and so forth. It's unconstitutional. And so they hired, because of the exigency of the need to get things done quickly, they hired this consultant. And here's where I might have a faulty member. I think the consultant was from North Carolina, who just knew maps and populations. And this person put together those type of districts. They put, for example, Merrimack, and this person did, Merrimack and Litchfield in the same district. Well, if you look at a map, there's like a little blue line that goes through there. That's called the Merrimack River. And you have to go 20 miles in either direction to go from one part of that district to another. That's, again, one of the things, obviously you avoid that. I mean, you have to be aware there's a mountain there, and you don't put a district, if you can avoid it, straddling geographical obstacles. And so in order to get done down and dirty, one thing you can always do, we couldn't do it with the 2006 constitutional amendment, but they didn't have that at the time, is you can just keep on lumping representatives together till you come up with that within that standard deviation. That's what that consultant did. It was bad for New Hampshire.
Well, we were lucky in a way because we played around with the ward boundaries with the town clerk, and we were able to get separate the 9 wards. Each had 3 representatives. and the average, only 2 of the wards had a plus, or a plus on the side of the number that you had, and the other 7 was slightly on the negative side,
Right.
but all fell within that boundary.
Yeah, yeah.
And the first, we had 2 trouble because the first person that looked at it wanted to put Litchfield in with Nashua, and that didn't work. But when we showed them that we had played around so that we hit the average, that we were within the boundaries of the average, and so it worked out well, I thought.
Yeah, no, we'd invited other cities such
Yeah.
as Nashua. I'm trying to remember who it was. Was it Salem? Some of the others. Divide yourself up into wards. You can do it. You're given permission by state law, and they wouldn't do it. They wanted these big districts, and that's kind of not the way that New Hampshire runs itself. We want state representatives who you see at the grocery store, that everybody knows. I'd get more instructions from my constituents when I'd go to the town dump in Mount Vernon than probably anywhere else, and that's good,
That's the interesting part, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting on 2 levels. One is people get to see, and the other thing that it's interesting is they realize, the Speaker of the House on Saturday morning takes the trash, takes it to the dump, and that makes government very approachable.
Yeah.
And so they will walk up to you and say, "What'd you do there?"
Yeah,
And you should be required to explain yourself as an elected official.
Well, hopefully people, when they look at this show too, will know that some of their representatives and get to talk to them.
Right.
And maybe one of these days we'll go back to, in 2010, we had debates.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember some of those.
I do.
We had 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats debating the issues. And I thought that was real well. But after...
Yeah, the instruction it's become fairly apparent on shows like this and by other examples that the Democrat Party, the state party, has given instructions to its elected officials: don't engage in debates. And I truly suspect it's because they know they'll lose those debates. Ours is a party of issues. Theirs is a party of government control. And we'd see it all the time. I've often cited, I've probably cited on this show before, that we did a study at one point, I think it might have been in 2010, 2012, and we looked back 3 or 4 terms and said, let's get the answer to the question that if a majority of Republicans are voting one way in a bill and a majority of Democrats are voting another way in a bill, what are the size of those majorities? And we would find that in those cases, the average size for Republicans was 85%. The average size for Democrats was 98%.
Yeah, right.
To Republicans, and I remember this very well because as a speaker, I was trying to get an agenda through and trying to have as productive a term as possible. But when you talk to Republicans, we share principles, but we don't share implementation all the time. And so, good people who are as good a conservative as I am would say, no, I'm not with you on that one. You try to say, well, this is our principle. Yeah, I believe in that principle, but I don't know that the principle applies the way you're applying it to this piece of legislation. I can give you an example. Right to work, I think, was very, very important to us, to the caucus, and important to the state for that matter. And, we were able to get probably, 80-85% again of Republicans going with us. We talk about, the freedom of it, the fact that you shouldn't have to go join a union to get state employment, for example. And good people would view it and say, no, I view it as freedom for employees to gather together and have a union and approach their employer that way. And I couldn't fault them for at least trying to apply a principle. That was the discussion we had. With the Democrats, they voted 100% against right to work because the instruction came down from high. That's what you do.
You can see that in just the last 2 years, too, the voting records that they had.
Well, they must be crazy. All these taxes that, in the face of a surplus in Concord,
right.
kind of show my great love here of the state house and state politics. But but I'm running for U.S. Senate. But in the face of a state surplus, they were voting tax increases. And that is something that most state representatives on our side wouldn't do as unnecessary, but on their side shouldn't do for political viability. And still they were doing it because that's what they were told to do.
Yeah. Well, you're going to have some fights when you get to the Senate, and I think that you have the same problem, but it's just larger.
Yeah, but what I can take to Washington is the lesson learned in Concord, that you can reduce the size of government, as we did, approaching 20% that year in terms of spending. And you can do it without things going awry. If you look at the public debt we have, it's $23 trillion. We're running up a deficit each year, running that deficit up by another $1 trillion each year. We're basically saying we want to have all these Disney World advantages, but we can't pay for it. So we're going to take out a credit card, charge it to that credit card, but that credit card's going to be in our children's name. So we're going to hand it to them and say, you pay for this Disney World-like existence we have now. And that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. We can reduce spending, that 20% that will take us to at least neutral spending in the federal government, and start to give our kids back their future. It's asking the same question. What does government have to do? It's a different set of answers for the federal government than state government. What has it been doing that is nice but not necessary? And how do we dial that back in a way that addresses some dependency of people on that kind of spending, send the signal that we're going in a different direction? And just what shouldn't we be doing at all? We shouldn't be funding Planned Parenthood at all. We shouldn't be funding public broadcasting. Public broadcasting was put in place when there were 3 commercial TV channels, and there was a need to have an arts and science channel.
Seems like they're surviving and then getting somebody else to pay for some of the stuff.
Oh yeah. And so you look at how unnecessary it is.
Yeah.
Do you know? I have no idea. Do you have any idea how many channels are on your cable system now? You run one of the shows, so you probably know. I live in Nashville now, and I've never figured it out. I'll just keep on flipping, and it's like going into the thousands.
I know. Almost every week I've come across people that don't even know about this channel.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all kinds of opportunity. And it used to be, before the days of cable, that it was public television. It was supposed to provide the public forum. It's completely unnecessary, but it's like Benjamin Franklin said about death and taxes. They just won't go away. Well, public television can go away. We defunded it in if you remember, we defunded it in out of the state budget. They were getting money from the state of New Hampshire. We defunded it. And so I don't know if you remember that episode. The university system came to us and said, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing this." It was like $8 million, and that's how we did it, by little increments. We made up $1 billion savings, and they said, "Well, we're just going to give it to them out of our budget." So we said, "Well, that's nice of you to inform us beforehand, because we're going to put a provision in the budget rather, saying that every dollar you give to public television will reduce the state's contribution to your budget by $1. We'll keep an ongoing audit and going to see how that works out for you." That's kind of the swamp-like behavior of bureaucrats.
Well, it'd be nice of you to pull that off in the federal.
It can be done. I think that there's a critical mass of representatives up there. There's a Freedom Caucus in the House. There's folks like Senator Cruz and Senator Lee, and some of the folks who have come up here and run for president aren't bad when it comes to budgetary issues. And I don't think I'm any magic when it gets involved, or have any magic when it gets involved in a legislative setting. But within 2 months of arriving at Concord, at that point, Speaker Scammon, who I didn't know at all before then, brought me into leadership. made me a caucus whip. And I think the reason he did it is I'd rather have this guy organizing in my leadership group than outside my leadership group. I think you can be very, very effective by understanding the Congress as an institution and by making your arguments about what this is doing to our country. It's become so extreme. People are going to listen.
Well, I hope so. I hope you're right in seeing that a new Congress will move in the right direction, and I hope. Well, what do you think about the impeachment part of it now? Is he going to be our leader in the next election?
Well, of course, he will be. There's such outrage about that I think many people feel in what they are doing, what the Democrats in the House are doing. I have an interest about what's going on in Congress. And so I watched some of the Intelligence Committee hearings. I spent a little bit of time watching the hearing that they had with those 4 lawyers in front of the House Judiciary Committee.
Was something else.
It really was. And so you don't have one person who's come forward as a witness and said that this man did anything wrong. You have a lot of speculation. You had evidence that was brought forward that if I, as I used to be, a trial lawyer trying criminal and civil cases, if I presented that type of evidence to a court, if I attempted to, not only would it never get into court, double and triple hearsay, it'd never get in, but probably the judge would have reported me to the Bar Association for an inquiry as to whether or not I should be removed as a lawyer. That's how awful their presentation was. The only person that they put on who actually spoke to the president about the Ukraine testified that the president told them, there's no quid pro quo here. There's nothing that I am looking for here. That's the state of their evidence. All they have is hatred. All they have is a constitutional expert in the form of this woman, I think her name was Pamela, and I can't remember her last name, who is so full of hate that she would bring in the name of the president's child into congressional testimony in order to mock the name. Which was so full of hate that when she was in Washington once, she said she had to cross the street to avoid walking in front of the Trump Hotel. And then they have another one that I can remember. This man's name is Noah Feldman. And he wrote an article praising Sharia law, talking about how it was so fair, for example, that they wouldn't stone a woman to death for adultery unless they had a confession from her or for female witnesses. There's 4 male witnesses who would testify to the adultery. These are the sort of moonbats that they brought forward as their constitutional experts, and they no sooner closed up that circus than the speaker gets up there, Pelosi, and says, "Oh, draft some articles of impeachment." This is how far hatred can take you.
I mean, that was so blatant. It surprised me that more people didn't. I mean, a lot of people saw that, but not all of them. I mean, it was just, that's right, hatred just pouring out of them. I mean, it wasn't illogical. I'd be embarrassed to put that kind of a witness up.
And I'd be embarrassed to push this proceeding forward. Again, I spent years, I graduated from law school, the way I earned my living until I started a software business about 4 years ago. The way I earned my living is a trial lawyer. And I would have been embarrassed and probably, as I mentioned, in professional jeopardy if I ever brought forward a case like this. I think what they have bought into is what the Communist Party used to call the big lie. I think actually Joseph Stalin talked about it. He said, little lies can be picked apart, and people view them skeptically. if you keep on repeating the big lie, there's this sort of mental approach
Right.
that says, well, you wouldn't say that unless it's true. They wouldn't say that there's bribery unless it's true. If you keep on saying bribery, then people are going to believe it.
And the people didn't even look and ask questions about some of the things that were in existence that justified his action. I mean, these were agreements between the countries that go back to the Clinton era.
The very piece of legislation that funded that military aid to Ukraine states within it that the State Department and the executive branch is to make an inquiry as to corruption,
Right.
and make sure that the money is going to the purpose of defending Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It was an entirely legitimate request. How is the corruption investigations going, President Zelensky? And from that, they take, we must be trying to affect the 2020 election. It is speculation based on hatred, and it has no foundation in facts.
Well, there's one good thing working out of all this stuff is looks like the economy is still healthy.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Isn't that something?
I mean, we just had the figures come out today on unemployment, and one of the most startling is that there's 7 million openings for jobs in the country, and only 6 million people who are looking for jobs. It doesn't get better. It doesn't get better than this. It's times of great prosperity because of the tax cuts that Donald Trump brought in, because of his deregulation, because we have starting to have sane judges. If only the Democrats would help us out by passing the Canada-Mexico treaty bill. If only they'd help us out by working on infrastructure improvements, we would have prosperity for the next 20 or 30 years.
Well, there's a lot of things that they're talking about now, and I just can't wait to see how they come out. And you brought up infrastructure. I think there's other things that are with controlling the people coming into the country, and looking at some of the ones that are in here that maybe don't belong in here.
Well, those certainly don't belong in here. A nation defines itself in part by its borders.
Right.
The Democrats, of course, want open borders because they want to import voters. It's exactly what it is. It's not that they care about it, poor people. If they cared about poor people, they wouldn't have victimized the black community decade after decade.
Right.
And made sure that they remained dependent. So they don't care. What they want are open borders because they don't love America.
Yeah. Well, you have a lot to look at coming up, and you have 11 months now to go.
Yeah, it's going on and on. It's a fun process. It really is.
Well,
it's fun seeing people night after night. And
you need some help. You want?
I do. Yeah. If people could go to my website, that would be great.
Okay.
It's Bill O'Brien 2020 Bill O'Brien 2020.com. And obviously, none of this gets going without financial assistance. You can donate on the website, and certainly we have on the website, some of the issues we're talking about. We have a Facebook page that you can just Google the Facebook page and look and see where I'm going to be and come and talk with me.
Okay. Well, good luck,
you,
and come back. We'll be talking during the next 11 months and see how your progress goes.
Yeah, it's fun to be here.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you for what you do too, and having these shows.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.